Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast for investors interested in Indigenous investment in Canada. Born from the Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit, the show focuses on the intersection of Indigenous economic strategies and investment opportunities. I'm Mark Manaka, and my co-host Robert Brandt and I are joined today by Mark Podlasly, Chief Executive Officer for First Nations Major Projects Coalition. As one of the driving forces behind the foundation of FNMPC, and he also sits on the board of CIBC and Hydro One, he discusses his commitment to secure continued access to affordably priced capital, and they currently support 14 projects with a total project expenditure of $45 billion. Join us as we explore how these critical conversations are reshaping economic development across Canada.
Mark Podlasly, welcome to Drumbeats. Real pleasure to have you with us. I know you've got a very busy schedule, a number of hats that you wear, so appreciate your time.
Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit about the history of the coalition, how it started and how it's grown?
The coalition started about 10 years ago when 11 First Nations in northern British Columbia had an opportunity to take a 30% equity stake options in a pipeline in northern British Columbia. And when they went off to the bank and financial institutions to raise the capital, they found very quickly that they could not find capital at an affordable rate. And that's because under the Indian Act in Canada, First Nations do not own their lands. They do not own any property. It's all held in trust by the federal government. So when you approach financial institutions with no assets, you can imagine what happens. The rate of capital were credit card rate types, 30, 35, 40%, which on a regulated return of 9 to 12% just doesn't work. So they lost that opportunity. Those leaders thought at that time going, you know what, this is going to happen again. We need an organization who can help us get past this issue, but also how do we all work together in a linear project, 11 nations that we're as nations, we weren't organized in that structure, a commercial structure, a revenue sharing, responsibilities, governance. So that's where the coalition came from. And then it's just grown by word of mouth. Originally, we were in British Columbia, and that's still where most of our members are because we're local. But eventually, nations across the country, one by one, would come forward saying, hey, we have this proposal of a nickel mine in our territory. We know nothing about this. How does this work? Critical minerals, everything from lithium, copper, scandium, cobalt, those started coming forward. Clean energy projects, geothermal, tidal on the coasts, also solar, wind, electric transmission lines. The Via Rail high-speed, fast frequency project in Ontario, Quebec has come forward. If you go through our website, you'll find all of these projects listed. And we've taken these projects on where we feel that we can offer benefit to those nations to not only get to the table, but to help their proponents get the projects built. And that's where the success has come from. We have never advertised. We don't take a finder's fee from the proponent nor the nation. We support the nation. We will help the companies, but our primary focus is to ensure that the nation is successful in these negotiations.
I want to start off by congratulating you on your new role as the CEO of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. But I know it arose under tragic circumstances. And so on behalf of everybody at Drumbeats, who want to pass on our condolences for the passing of your friend and former colleague, Nilo Edwards. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about Nilo to begin?
Well, Nilo Edwards was the initial CEO of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. And I joked at times that I was the second employee of the coalition, 5 seconds after him. We were co-founders of this organization almost a decade ago. And at that time, we had been tasked by the chiefs and leaders of the communities in northern British Columbia to set up an organization that would help them negotiate equity stakes in major projects in their territory. And so we went off to do that. And we started on road trips in northern Canada, meeting communities, then going off to meet companies. And we were told that what we were doing was audacious. And that was how I described Nilo. It was turmoil at the beginning, snowstorms in northern Canada, dirt roads, bad food as we started this off. And the initial nations there have grown now to 175 across the country. And now we're seeing success in negotiating equity options in everything from electric transmission lines, natural gas pipelines. We're working on geothermal plants. All of this came about because of the inability of Nilo Edwards to say no. and we will miss him. We will miss him. The one
Right.
thing that was great about Nilo as well is that he was a lover of life. He was only 37 when he died from cancer related to an organ transplant, which is very sad. But in that time, he accomplished so much, and we are grateful for what he's given, and we will miss him deeply.
He'll be missed by many, many people across Canada and in other parts of the world too. He made a big impact in the short time he was with us. We'll talk a bit about FNMPC and that organization, the success that it has become over the last 10 years. But maybe first, let's talk about your background. Where are you from?
I am from a First Nation in British Columbia, in southern British Columbia, near Merritt, BC. We are the Intlakabem, and our traditional territory stretches from south central British Columbia into Washington State in the United States. And we are 15 bands in one linguistic nation. And we are well connected by transportation links to Vancouver, Kamloops, and into the rest of Canada. And I live in Vancouver, though, as sort of the economic center of British Columbia, where I live on the Musqueam Reserve, just outside UBC, in the west side of Vancouver.
And before you, along with Nilo, started FNMPC, what were you doing before that?
I started my career in natural gas here in British Columbia. Eventually had the opportunity to go to Harvard for graduate studies at the Kennedy School of Government and at the Harvard Business School, which I did complete. And at that time, I fell into the energy of the East Coast of the United States. So I was actually very involved in building projects worldwide, actually in cities and infrastructure. I was very much, I was the vice president of project development at a project called Songdo International City, which is in Korea, which is now built, which was a copy of Singapore, meant to compete in that northeast sector of Asia. So I had spent considerable time commuting between the East Coast of the United States and Southeast Asia. A lot of that experience came back to use when we came back to Canada. We had a child in Boston, and even though it's three time zones away, you can imagine the cries from the grandmothers back on the west coast of Canada. So when we came back, BC at that time had 14 LNG proposals across it right now, all of them crossing Indigenous territories, all of them trying to get consent, trying to get sign off. And it was complete mayhem. And the elders of my community and the leadership, Indigenous leadership at BC, asked me to come in and sit through one of these presentations to see, well, what was going on. And it was very clear that the two groups were not connecting. You'd have dozens of Indigenous communities being talked at by engineers from energy companies from around the world, and there wasn't a connection. So since I started my career in energy, I had completed a lot of work at Harvard in executive education, and I had worked with many of these companies previously. I was asked to come in and sort it out. And what it came down to is just a matter of both parties not speaking the same language. It was English, but they weren't understanding each other. That eventually morphed into what we see now in the coalition, where there's a meeting of the minds, where you've got industry and Indigenous at the same table trying to work towards mutual goals. So that was my background. So I fell into this work at the coalition quite naturally, having done this circuit through Harvard, Asia, back to Canada, now home.
A really interesting background, Mark. But, it always surprises me a little bit. So there you were doing a deal in Korea, right?
Yes.
Not a lot of, you're from BC,
Yeah.
right? Korea, but that project was going ahead, no problem, right? So there's obviously another factor that people did not perceive, and many perhaps still don't. The Indigenous peoples is, hey, they are different, right? Just because they're in this land called Canada, you just can't assume the way you've done business with other Canadians is the same way.
That is so true. I would meet Canadians overseas, and Canadians going into Asian markets would understand that there's cultural protocols, there's ways to act, there's ways to engage, there's ways to introduce yourself, there's protocol. But I think in Canada at times, Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians, forget that. They think, oh, we're all Canadian, we're all here together, and they go on with this assumption that they can do business as normal as they would do in Toronto or in Montreal or in any other city in the country, Calgary. But that's not the case. Indigenous communities, Indigenous nations have cultures and protocols, just as an Asian community would. What was really interesting about the work that we're doing now with the coalition is we're watching outreach from Asian businesses and companies into First Nations, particularly in the West, where they come in with a very well-honed understanding of the cultural protocols. And what we're finding is that they're getting better traction than individuals out of Toronto, just because they have that awareness that they're dealing in a different culture.
Very, very insightful.
I mean, the international partners, are they coming through government to reach the Indigenous community? Are they going direct nation to nation?
They're going direct nation, straight to the nation. So, for example, there was a delegation of Japanese business coming looking towards hydrogen export opportunities. And they have learned in the past that going through government sometimes is not productive. So what they want to do is meet the people directly. So they'll go into the communities and the bottom line they're asking is that we've had issues before with blockades by Indigenous protesters on projects. British Columbia, that's happened quite often. This time they're asking, so if we're going to come and we make this investment, is it a safe investment? Will we get our return? Will you block it? What's interesting about that, though, is that is a nation-to-nation engagement. It's the equivalent of it. It's company to nation. It's the same thing. It's chief to chief. And that pays dividends. Communities felt heard. And then the big thing now is that communities want to be part of these economic benefits that are coming from these projects. They don't want to be bystanders. And we find at times as nations is that government doesn't come in speaking like that. Government comes in with a set mindset, which is not always focused on what the nations want.
We've noticed in Europe, in the UK in particular, and that's one of the reasons we started the Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit last year, a perception amongst European and British investors, partners, that projects can't get completed in Canada because Indigenous communities are against them. And media coverage of blockades and court cases, and so in some cases past experience with projects that didn't get completed because of local opposition, has given an impression that all Indigenous communities are against all development, and that's definitely not the case. You prove it every day, and that's one of the reasons we're continuing with the summit and engaging with international investors to show that there is support when these projects are approached in the right manner.
So the Coalition is a nonprofit, Indigenous-led organization. We have 175 members across the country in every time zone, in every part of the country. And these are nations who come forward voluntarily. We've never marketed because they want to be involved in major projects, providing the projects are done in a manner that is compatible with what they're after. And that might be better environmental protections, the planning and decommissioning projects, or the economic benefits, something. So if there's 600 nations in the country and 175 are part of this organization voluntarily, it should smash that impression that Indigenous people are against development. Indigenous people are against being pushed aside. That's the big difference. And in the past, that's always what happens.
But things have changed, haven't they, over the last, say, 10 to 15 years? You've seen it in the growth of your coalition. And Canada is unique in that regard around the world with the structures, the types of arrangements that are being made to partner with Indigenous communities to get projects done. There's some really innovative things happening. The Canadian law is becoming more and more supportive, and business seem to have realized that regardless of what the law says, if you want to get these things done, you are going to have the support of the Indigenous community.
What we're finding now is that companies are coming into communities realizing that Indigenous people can be a strategic partner. Part of that is because very few of these projects, especially larger projects, major projects, is the proponents, 100% of the proponents' capital. They have to find other capital to come into these projects. Capital is risk adverse. They want to know if their investors putting their money in that they will get a return. If you have the Indigenous partner on board as a co-owner or co-equity position, that makes the First Nation a co-proponent. And what co-proponent is going to oppose their own investment? So as far as we're concerned, it's a no-brainer at that point. You have alignment on the project, and then in theory, on the approach to government for permitting. And in some cases, our members go forward representing the project for the permitting on behalf of the partnership. And think about how that reduces red tape and bureaucracy when you're trying to get through the system.
Absolutely. And what do you see as, we talked about this transition, here you are, both of you, leaders in your field, well respected, and you have this whole talent pool that has never been tapped into, but now you have Indigenous leaders in top organizations across the country helping to shape and influence them. How do you think that's going to change the next 10 years? If you look what you've accomplished in the past 10, Mark, is FNMPC, what's that going to look like when you have access to those decision makers on the other side of the table when you're trying to get things done?
Well, what you're going to find is that this will be common sense. It'll become common sense to have an Indigenous partner in some respects in your partner. And it doesn't matter in what capacity, as long as the nation feels that they've been heard and that they've been respected. And what you'll see is an acceleration of projects being approved, built, operating. You're starting to see some challenges right now from the United States about where Canada has access to the world. Well, we need to diversify our buyers. We need to be out in the world. And in Canada, you need Indigenous consent to move these projects forward to get government permitting. We have an opportunity now going forward to speed that up in partnership with Indigenous people. And this is to benefit all of Canada. It's not just for the Indigenous people. It's for everybody. It provides the revenues for general Canadian expenditures in terms of healthcare, education, environmental protection, investment in our infrastructure. So we have a grand opportunity to turn this history on its head in a very short time, as long as everybody realizes that we're all in this together. And First Nations, through the Major Projects Coalition, have already indicated that they're willing to do that. Yes.
I keep thinking the Indigenous peoples of Greenland are actually going to look and say, yeah, you might have a lot of money in America, but, we really are brothers and sisters. There's an artificial border because we used to cross those waters, no problem. I think we'll join Canada, or Canada will join us. How would that be? Wouldn't that go down well?
Well, if the Indigenous Greenland population wants to do that, great. But I think that would be a longer term perspective. Talk about causing more fireworks, though, in terms of what would happen south of the border.
Absolutely, right.
Why don't we just invite Panama at the same time? Like, they can come along too.
Exactly. They'll be concerned they're being constrained.
It's an interesting time, Mark, to take over leadership at the coalition. Some challenges south of the border. We've got in Canada uncertainty. A new leader, a new prime minister will be appointed in the next month or so. Possible election, definite election before October. Possible change in government. How does all of that look, all of that uncertainty affect the plans of the coalition over the next year or so?
So in terms of Canada, change in government, we are a non-political organization. We focus primarily on two issues: economic self-determination for nations and environmental self-determination. We have been purposefully avoiding the politics. There's enough political organizations in this country, especially in the Indigenous realm, that they take care of that quite nicely. And we think whatever happens with the government in the United States or in Canada, or new prime ministers and new parties, we're still going to need Canadian advancement in building these projects, infrastructure, clean energy. It's still going to be needed, it doesn't matter who the government is, and we are still focused on that, and we will remain laser focused on that. We will work with any government that's coming in, and in many respects, it's the capital that's more important to these projects right now than the government in Ottawa.
Our audience is UK, Canadian, and other parts of the world. Is there enough capital in Canada to meet the needs over the next few years to get these projects done?
Canada has always had outside investment for the development of resources or infrastructure in this country, and that will continue. From a First Nations perspective, First Nations will require about $585 billion in the coming decades to make co-investments in these projects. So is there enough money in the country to cover that? We don't think so. We know that our outreach to investors worldwide is important, that we are an important part of Canada's export capabilities and part of Canada's infrastructure. And the needs that this country require will need First Nations. So we see ourselves as working with the rest of Canada to attract that capital, to make sure that the investments are made for the benefit of everyone.
Yes, well spoken.
You're relatively new to the role, and I know it's been a bit of a whirlwind the last few months, but what are the priorities for the coalition in the coming year?
The big one is continued access to affordably priced capital for First Nations, for Indigenous people. In this country, it is very difficult for nations to access traditional sources of capital because under the Indian Act, which was passed in the 1800s, Indigenous people, particularly First Nations, we don't own anything. All of our assets are held in trust by the Crown, the federal government, for our use. So we may have land that we're using, property, income, but technically it's not ours. It's all held by the federal government, which means we technically have no assets. So that makes it very difficult to access capital, at least at an affordable rate. Our big push of the coalition is to continue to knock that barrier down, to ensure that nations do have the ability to participate in the economy like anyone else.
Fantastic stuff. Maybe give us an idea of some of the projects you're working on now or recently completed, some of your favorites, most innovative.
So the coalition at the moment, these are all on our website, is that we're supporting 14 projects now with a total capital expenditure of $45 billion. And those projects are across the country. 85% of the projects we support are in clean energy. Clean energy projects are easier for First Nations because they have a regulated rate return. They tend to be smaller, unlike a major mine can be $5 to $8 billion, but energy is easier to manage in terms of working with consumers and investors. The two projects that we're very proud of right now, the first one is the Chatham to Lakeshore Power Line in Ontario. That is has 5 First Nations in a co-ownership, co-equity position, 50% with the local utility, which is groundbreaking. That model now will be replicated across Ontario and has become the standard for the world. We've had Indigenous parties from around the world contact us going, how does that work? 50% equity ownership. And that will provide stable revenues to those communities. It provides them a say in the planning, operation, and decommissioning. It's also, remember, about decommissioning of projects. That's astounding. The other project we're quite proud of is a 10% equity stake in a gas pipeline across northern British Columbia. And this project, again, is a number of First Nations working together in a commercial structure where they have that equity option. Their challenge right now is to find the capital, and we're working on it. But those are the beginnings of the projects that we have been working on. We have other projects in land development. There's a 15 megawatt geothermal power station in there. There's interest from a number of clean energy projects across the country. There's also critical minerals interest right now in northern Ontario and other parts of the West. We've been told that there's a number of nations in Quebec who are about to join the coalition because they're looking for skill sets in the same sort of projects in that part of the country. A lot of these projects for export, and that puts us into trade situations, which, quite frankly, we've always been in. If you look back even to the fur trade in Canada, what was that about? Well, it was export of materials from Canada out, and they needed First Nations to do it. So there's a lot of things happening, and we're quite proud of the work we've done and how we've helped nations get to the table and reach their ambitions.
When you talk about supporting a project and helping members, what is the coalition actually doing?
We are a nonprofit. We don't take a finder's fee. We don't take any fee from the nations. We're primarily supported by government right now, which we're working to diversify that into our own income streams. But what we are is a capacity organization. We support the organization to find the skill sets, and if they haven't got them, we will find them for them to get to the table, to negotiate, to participate. And that can go the gambit from how do you do a commercial structure to what is this industry about? For example, critical minerals or clean energy, how does it work? We've had questions about small modular nuclear reactors as well. That's an issue that nations are curious about. We will help them get to the table, negotiate a deal, corporately structure themselves in a way that where they are working perhaps with multiple First Nations in a linear project. We run the gambit of it. So we are a support organization.
It's really an advantage to have an organization like yours that has insight into so many projects, different sectors across the country, and an ability to share that knowledge and those learnings. That is priceless, a priceless benefit to be able to give to members who who have done projects or projects on the scale that they're looking at now ever before.
We have had a lot of interest over the past 2 or 3 years from nations who want to move into export markets. And to do that, they understand where they are on that supply chain. And in order to build that capacity to participate, and the big one to think about is going forward, is what they do after they've had success. Revenues start flowing in. The revenues might be used immediately by the nation, but you're starting to see situations now of large capital pools controlled by Indigenous people growing across the country. And you're going to start to see direct placement of investment by those communities in projects in their interest, in their territories. And that should be of great interest to Canada. It should be of great interest to proponents that there's a local source of capital that brings with it not just the capital, but the rights, the Indigenous rights that would make a project more competitive, especially in raising capital from other sources.
Yes, very much so. Coming back to some of the projects that you've described, are all those nations part of your coalition, or sometimes, 8 out of 10? How does that work?
We don't represent all nations in this country. And if a nation decides they don't want development, that's their right. They won't be a member of the coalition, obviously, because we do one thing. So if they're not part of the coalition, that's fine. The projects I've described, if they're linear projects, and that in the case of the gas pipeline in British Columbia, there's, I think, 22 nations in the entire corridor. There are only 11 are with us. The others are with other parties or negotiating or opposed. So we will work with those communities if they want to address that with other communities who might be opposed or their councils, but it just depends on the situation. In some cases, we don't say yes to all projects that come forward to the coalition. If it's something that we do not feel that we can add value at this point, we will refer them to someone else. But in many cases, the projects fall into two main areas, which is critical minerals, clean energy. So we will do our best to help the community with those challenges.
Maybe, Mark, tap into some of your knowledge and experience on community engagement particularly for international audience who are thinking about partnering, investing with Indigenous communities. Any best practices you want to talk about?
It's a simple process. Come have coffee. That's the starting point. These are about relationships. And we've seen at times companies and governments do this too. They'll fire off a letter from their lawyer to the council in very legal terms or business terms about what they're expecting. If you were going to go meet your neighbor for the first time, would you have a lawyer draft a letter and send it over and say, we would like to discuss the following on the following time? The garden, the fence, the hose, the water use, and your sprinkling use. No, people forget that. These are people in communities who are normal people. And Canadians have a challenge at times. Canadians can be overly polite and forget that. That's what it comes down to. So the example I gave earlier, the Japanese are just coming direct, coming by, wanting to meet people, introducing themselves, building a relationship. And then you can ask about things like the fence, the watering, the noise from your neighbor. But you can't do that until you've actually met them. And I know it sounds simple, but companies forget that. Investors forget that.
Yeah, as much as I don't like to hear about lawyers being cut out of any process, I hear what you're saying.
I'm careful here because I know you're a lawyer, but people aren't going to bond over a cup of coffee across the backyard fence if a lawyer has come in first to set the terms for the chat. There's a chance for a lawyer to get involved later once there's something substantive to talk about, but it's that relationship. So at the coalition, we've had companies from overseas contact us saying, look, we're interested in this or that, and we don't know how to proceed. We don't know how to make contact with this nation because they might be overseas. And we're happy to introduce them. saying this is fine. We know if they're members of the coalition, is to say, here's so-and-so, here's the community, we'll do the introduction, and then we'll see where it goes.
So that's a great example, Mark. So does that happen that overseas investors come to your organization first and say, can you tell us anything about who we need to talk to in this? Or can you describe a couple of examples like that?
I don't name the companies. We've had a European company come forward. They were bidding on a government contract, and they knew that part of the government contract is by point system, and one of them was an Indigenous involvement, Indigenous engagement, Indigenous benefits that might flow from this new project or contract. And they contacted us and said, well, and they were big. They were worldwide, but they didn't have contacts in this area. So we helped them. And so, yeah, sure, we'll tell you who they are. We'll contact the members who are in the area and say, this is the company, this is what they'd like to do, this is the individual, would you like to meet them? And done that. The Japanese example, which I referenced in terms of Japanese officials and company officials coming into communities in British Columbia and asking to meet Indigenous people directly, that came about because of a contact through the Major Projects Coalition. And then we brought the nations down, and people are curious. If you have 175 members in a coalition like ours, they want business, they want investment, they want opportunities. So it's a perfect fit. One thing I'd like to point out too is that we put at the coalition, we run an annual conference every April on some topic of Indigenous corporate engagement. We bring the best examples together. Our last conference, we had 1,700 people, and we've had leading tribal Indigenous members from the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, who are starting to come, and leading corporate types who are also trying to make that connection. So CEOs of natural gas energy companies in Canada. Our keynote speaker was the US CEO of the Bank of America this year. We've had the US Secretary of Energy come. So we are starting to become that point where it's safe for parties to come in and say, look, this is what we want to talk about. We do not talk about the political rights discussion that might have happened in the news last week. We are focused on environment and commercial to get to our members' desire to be partners in these projects.
Well, Mark Podlasly, thank you again for joining us. Really interesting discussion, fascinating time. Wishing you all the best, everyone at the Coalition. Keep up the good work, and we look forward to welcoming you very shortly at the second annual Canadian Indigenous Investment Summit in London on the 10th of April.
I am very much looking forward to meeting you both in person and sharing the message of the coalition to those in attendance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's been wonderful to have you on. Thank you to Mark Podlasly for sharing his insights with us. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to subscribe and leave a review by following our YouTube channel, Drumbeats Podcast. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms shown in the description below. Visit our website for more resources and upcoming discussions. And of course, mark your calendar for the upcoming 2025 summit taking place on the 10th of April. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.